So we've covered a lot of issues surrounding electromagnetic energy before, but a listener not too long ago sent us an article. I think he said he found it in his garage wrapped around something, maybe even a story about his grandfather handing it over. But he knew about the issue too, but he was surprised to look back and see there it was printed in the paper from sometime in 1974. Radio waves may affect mankind. And essentially, you have an Associated Press story admitting that electromagnetic pollution, electromagnetic smog, EMF signals could be hurting people at lower levels than previously acknowledged. And it reads, the government scientists have reported to Congress that preliminary studies indicate radio wave radiation may affect man, quote, at lower levels than anticipated in the past. It goes on to read, this would be caused by power levels in and around cities, airports, military installations, and tracking centers, ships, pleasure craft, industries, and the home. The study was prompted by knowledge that microwaves and other radio frequency radiations at sufficiently high intensity are known to cause adverse biological effects due to the generation of heat. And that's going to become important to the debate. The interagency study under the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy said a year of study suggests that effects may occur in the nervous system and behavior, normal development and growth processes, and possibly some metabolic and biochemical parameter at lower levels than anticipated in the past. So it could affect your nervous system, your behavior, your growth and development, as well as metabolic and biochemical parameters. Basically, it could screw up potentially your entire body process. It can affect your biological health, your behavior, your nervous system, your growth, pretty much everything. It's very important. The study emphasized, however, that these are preliminary observations and not scientifically validated results. The OTP said the study is being coordinated with that of Soviet scientists, and the U.S. will send a team to Russia May 24 to 29 to discuss the biological effects of non-ionizing radiation. That is, radiation that doesn't cause heat. It has a non-ionizing effect that still affects behavior, according to the studies. They will return the visit by a Soviet team last month to this country to discuss environmental pollution. The report of the U.S. effort included these comments. More work is needed involving chronic exposure over extended periods of time, as well as observations for possible delays of effects following exposure. Most of the present studies involve exposures over relative short periods of time, and long-term studies involving periods up to the lifespan of the animal and studies of successive generations involve considerable cost and dedicated exposure facilities, and in essence, such studies are not underway now. What is needed, though, is more work with exposure durations of at least several months. But they go on to explain that basically funding is wanting and these studies are not likely to be forthcoming. While the level of financial activity related to this program increased in 1973, the overall funding level has been lower than desirable with respect to developing new approaches, facility requirements, and attracting new investigators. In other words, they're not going to investigate it fully, at least not at this time, in 73-74. When the study was launched last year, the OTP report said unless adequate monitoring programs and methods of control are instituted in the near future, man may soon enter an era of energy pollution of the environment. If they don't do more studies and reports and take safeguards, in other words, they admit in the report, man may soon encounter an unfriendly era of energy pollution in his environment. And so this article was not only published admitting that there were non-ionizing radiation dangers, but it was syndicated across the country there in late May 1974. We've got articles from May 21st of that year and other dates surrounding it. And there's several different headlines as it was reprinted. Some of those are not only variations like radio waves may do harm at low levels. It also appeared with the headline, radio wave perils cited, but this story was also republished with the extremely alarming headline, Did Firms Conceal a Link to Cancer? And it's the same story. It doesn't go on to directly discuss that. So the story got out there a little bit in 74, but how much action was ever taken, and why are they hinting at corporations concealing these risks and dangers that may include cancer? Of course, everything is just an exacerbation of the system. If you tax any part of the system too much, it could cause serious problems, including cancer and death. So the nervous system, the endocrine and hormone systems, the growth systems in different cells throughout your body, all of these could be targeted. But the fact of the matter is that there has been a concealment on this issue. I'm going to get into that in a second by reading a short passage from The Body Electric by Robert O. Becker, a guy who's already passed on, but who has a lot of credibility in this area. It's been a major focus of his life's work. Now, there's a lot of background on this story, but in essence, the development of radar really began the search for possible risks associated with electromagnetic energy from radar, but also from other devices, including television antennas, television signals, walkie-talkies, radio signals, antennas basically of all kinds. Obviously are putting out electromagnetic energy. Since the very beginning of this, the official U.S. position in the military and various institutions of Washington, D.C., in the academic circles, has pretty much been based around the ionizing effect, the heating effect of microwaves and other EMF energy. That basically, with radar, you could microwave someone to the point of doing direct damage, of overheating something, and that can even go as far as burning someone basically to death. But it can also, stimulate a tumor through the heat, overactivate certain parts of the system if it gets very hot. And so, as Melissa has explained in other videos and many authors have covered, basically they've pinned the danger threshold around the heat threshold and assumed and defended and legally put forward that any level of electromagnetic signal that doesn't meet the threshold for heating the body and causing heat damage, ionizing radiation, is basically harmless. But it's very interesting to note that at the same time, the Soviet counterparts, who were also working with radar through World War II and afterwards, they were also doing their own studies for potential harm, and they were pegging the levels much lower, and they had very, very, very strict regulations for their military and government officials and for the population in general, and effectively put into position policies that shielded their own population from even very low levels of harm. Meanwhile, it was later revealed that they were experimenting on U.S. government officials, especially at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, by deliberately targeting them with microwave radiation. Apparently, it was a synergistic effect of several frequencies overlapping one another, and they may or may not have been testing what the harmful biological effects were on people who were officially outside of Soviet soil, because a number of U.S. ambassadors had health problems. Some of them died early from cancer. A lot of the office workers and secretaries and staff officials also had alarming incidents and health effects that may have been attributed to a long period of time where the Soviets were bombarding the U.S. Embassy. And what's interesting about that as well is that the Soviet scientists were meeting with U.S. officials this entire time since the early 50s, warning them of electromagnetic energy dangers even at low levels based on their own studies. And basically, Robert O. Becker goes on to explain that either the U.S. didn't believe the Soviets and thought they were playing some kind of trick, or they disregarded it, because either way, they maintained safety levels for electromagnetic signals that, again, only included the heat effects and ignored all data suggesting that lower level electromagnetic effects could have biological effects, could affect the human nervous system, growth and development, as we've discussed. And therefore, they put it into practice. They have no liability because of the standards for anything negative that happened, and they have effectively been experimenting on the U.S. population for many years. And it wasn't until the late 70s and early 80s that academics in the US began to acknowledge this and start getting companies to voluntarily lower the safety limit to lower and lower levels while not changing the rules officially, again, to offer liability for the many activities going on where this is an issue. And of course, probably the first line of defense here is within military facilities where radar workers in particular and many other personnel in general were exposed to significant levels of electromagnetic energy over sustained periods of time at various signal strengths and frequencies that have various effects. But there have been effects. There's a lot of anecdotal reports that we've heard even and that other people have talked about where radar operators went on to not be able to have children. They were found to be sterile, basically. Did they have something to do with their close exposure to microwave radiation and they're working with electronics at a military capacity? That's a definite possibility. But this is in no way limited to military experimentation or government activities, because this is affecting Americans in major U.S. cities all across the country as well. Robert O. Becker goes to some length to explain how everything from CB radio usage to just watching television and the VHF and UHF bands is exposing people to risks. So I'm going to kind of pick up in the middle of a chapter he calls Maxwell's Silver Hammer. This is the book, The Body Electric, and I'm coming in around page 311 and some of the pages afterwards. And he's basically mapping signal levels and certain cities he's used as examples who are exposed through radio and TV signals above the safety levels recognized by USSR scientists. And he's in no way favoring the Soviets in the Cold War context. He's very much an American. There's nothing to indicate he's anti-American or anything. He's just recommending that the U.S. also take responsibility for the effects that are happening at low signal levels and implement safety standards that could protect people and acknowledge the risks. And he says here, after noting the microwave exposure from walkie-talkie risks to different particular parts of the body, that although most people's absorption doesn't approach the SWAN guideline, which again has to do with ionizing effects, the heat, it should be clear by now that the lower levels are little cause for comfort. You hear that? Lower signal levels are little cause for comfort. Everywhere in Western nations, except in the most remote forest or deserts, the ambient energy from ELF power signals, extremely low frequencies, is several thousand times above the Earth's background field strength, and it provides abundant interference with the biocycle timing cues. So he's pointing out here something that scientists have found throughout the decades. This has been reproduced and experimented upon. That it's been shown that the bioclock of the body is affected by these low signal strengths. It interferes with sleep. It interferes with the quality of sleep, the ability to sleep. We live in an age where people have trouble getting basic sleep. You know, is this related? I don't know. It's throwing off the pineal gland and its interaction with the brain and its neurochemistry. And basically, it's affecting people's biocycles. Living in the modern world amongst electricity and these electronic devices, it's affecting people. Moreover, the accumulated research has clearly shown that small doses often have the same effects as larger ones. And why would that be? I don't know, but that's what they found in studies, and it's a very significant finding. They talk about Ross Day, who we've looked into quite a bit, who did extensive experimentation with this stuff and who discovered certain related effects. Ross Day, who has intensively studied the window effect, quote unquote, in which a certain result is produced at some frequencies and power levels, but not at others, interspersed between the effective ones. And he believes that future research will reveal such windows at much lower levels, even fractions of a microwatt. So I read that basically that there's sweet spots.
The white zone is for immediate.
And then there's frequencies where there's no particular effect. And then there's sweet spots where there's very particular types of effects on nervous system and behavior. Certain frequencies cued in, dialed in just right, can make you aggressive. They can make you lethargic. They can make you depressed. Pretty much the range of emotions can be cued by particular frequencies. And we demonstrated that with the wired devices in our Minds of Men film, especially through the work of Jose Delgado.
The master control for the whole body resides in the brain.
The patients were definitely changed.
But the guys who followed in the decades after, and also Delgado's later work, show that there's these very specific, very important effects, even with a weak electromagnetic signal, and that the particular frequency is tied to the particular type of behavioral effect or the effect on growth and development. Indeed, there's already been one report of brainwave changes suggesting resonance of neuroelectric currents with radio waves and microwaves down to a billionth of a microwatt. And he goes on to explain how there really is no truly safe standard, not as far as the testing, but they know that higher levels are definitely dangerous, and that sustained exposure is definitely dangerous. This book was originally published in 1985, and I really don't know how much this stuff has advanced. I don't think there are these safety standards in place, but they've gotten a little better than they were in the 50s and the decades after that. He writes that there's a chance of somewhat stricter rules in a few years. In 1982, the American National Standards Institute recommended that the radio wave safety level be lowered to 1,000 microwatts and the microwave level to 5,000. This was the first semi-official admission that non-thermal effects do exist, and now several federal agencies have begun discussing a formal regulation. The most likely source is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, but at last report, the rumored EPA proposal of a 100 microwatt limit for the general public, anticipated in 1984, was abruptly and indefinitely postponed due to dissension within and pressure from outside the agency. Did corporations cover up a link to cancer? That's what this headline from 1974 asks, and you see traces of it in this continuity of not addressing the safety standards and of doing less than they should. And for what reason? Well, we can only surmise who would benefit from that. A health-protecting federal standard would have a major impact on both industry and government. Industry would experience a decline in revenue and an increase in costs. Government, especially the military, would be inconvenienced in a multitude of activities. Both would be subject to lawsuits for exposures and damage prior to establishment of the standard. In addition, we must understand that no amount of artificial EMR, no matter how small, has been proven safe for continuous exposure. Bioeffects have been found at the lowest measurable doses. However, we must also understand that the greatest danger lies in uncontrolled exposure to large amounts of EMR at overlapping frequencies, and therefore a stringent standard with a definite timetable for phasing it in is the only way to protect the public health. But now we live in an age where 5G has been approved, it's being rolled in, and the safety standards aren't there. The safety standards for the technology that already existed prior to that standard, they're not there. The safety standards aren't there, and according to Robert O. Becker, it would basically be because of the liability from lawsuits to both the industry and the government, the military, and also the fact that they would have to change things. And these things are being used for experimental purposes. They go on to explain some of the nasty things that they can do. We're going to get into that here in just a second. Robert O. Becker writes on page 314, all of the industrialized West is locked into a false position on electropollution's risks. It's these countries that have made the maximum use of electromagnetism for power, communications, and entertainment. The Soviet Union and China, partly due to underdevelopment and wartime destruction, and partly by choice, have severely limited its use and the exposure of their civilians. Now, I don't know if that's still true today for China in particular, but the point is, there really has just been a throwing of caution to the wind and assuming that unless there's dead bodies that are directly linked to this stuff, that they have a direct liability, that they're going to ignore it. The Soviet scientists have consistently assumed that any radiation that doesn't occur in nature will have some effect on life. We, the West, have consistently made the opposite assumption. Throughout our recent history, American regulators have followed a, quote, dead body policy. They've extended no protection until there was a proof of harm sufficient to overcome all deception. There's no longer any question that as far as electromagnetic energy is concerned, we've been wrong and the Soviets have been right. And he goes on to explain that back in the 1950s, Russian doctors conducted extensive clinical exams of thousands of workers who've been exposed to microwaves during the development of radar. Having disclosed serious health problems, these studies weren't swept under the rug. Instead, the USSR set limits of 10 microwatts for workers and military personnel and 1 microwatt for others, for the general population. Both levels are strictly enforced. When this first became known in the West in the early 60s, instead of checking their assumptions, many American scientists and administrators chose to believe this was Russian propaganda aimed at embarrassing us, and obviously, they then ignored it and didn't implement lower safety standards and assumed that there was no harm, at least no harm that they could be tied to and pinned with liability. By 1971, when they presented their work at a momentous conference in Warsaw, Zenaida V. Gordon and Maria Sakikova of the USSR Institute of Labor Hygiene and Occupational Diseases, I guess their version of OSHA, had identified a comprehensive series of symptoms, which they called microwave sickness. Its first signs are low blood pressure and slow pulse. The later and most common manifestations are chronic excitation of the sympathetic nervous system, a stress syndrome, and high blood pressure. This phase often includes headaches, dizziness, eye pain, sleeplessness, irritability, anxiety, stomach pain, nervous tension, inability to concentrate, hair loss, plus an increased incidence of appendicitis, cataracts, reproductive problems, and yes, cancer. The chronic symptoms are eventually succeeded by crises of adrenal exhaustion, heart disease, a blockage of coronary arteries, and heart attacks. How many of these awful symptoms, most of which are directly tied to the nervous system, are affecting Americans today? I'm sure it's in synergy with other factors, but how much has this overall sapped the energy and the livelihood and the lifespans of the people in this country over the past 50 to 70 years? We don't know the toll. It's unmeasurable, and yet they've found the effects. We could expect that this probably is a factor in combination with everything else that is piled up as a factor that is making cancer so prevalent, that's making heart disease, heart attacks, early death, very common, that's increased anxiety overall, and that's created basically a modern world of unhealth, of dis-ease, because safety standards haven't been recognized and it's been assumed that people are fine. And on page 315, he continues and says, these Soviet standards were set long before these dangers were clear. They were just doing it anyway. The comparison is instructive. At a 1969 International Symposium on Microwaves in Richmond, Virginia, Dr. Karol Marha of Prague's Institute of Industrial Hygiene defended his findings on birth defects and recommended that the Eastern European standard be adopted in the West. Replying to objections that the dire predictions hadn't been proven beyond a doubt, he said, our standard is not only to prevent damage, but to avoid discomfort in people. And whatever else is true about the Soviets, their standard on electromagnetic energy respected the comfort and the health of people to a much greater degree. It's just true in this case. Apparently, this concern doesn't include Americans, for the Soviets have been bombarding our embassy in Moscow with microwaves for some 30 years. And he goes into a lot of detail about this. I don't want to get too much into that case here, but it was a known thing, and the CIA found out about it, and they studied it, but they didn't warn the public or the people working in the embassy or tell the American public in general for over a decade. He writes that in 1952, at the height of the Cold War, there was a secret meeting in the Sandia Corporation in New Mexico by the U.S. and USSR scientists. A secret meeting just after World War II to discuss these effects. And so they allegedly exchanged information on biological hazards and safety levels, but it seems the exchange wasn't completely reciprocal, or perhaps the Americans didn't take seriously what the Russians told them. Even though today it's been backed by science, it's been proven and verified and shown to be a legitimate factor, a significant factor. But at the time, they apparently didn't believe them over at the Sandia Corporation, where they make so many weapons and do so many experiments.
Radars like the AN-TPS-25, a transportable battlefield surveillance radar, under certain conditions can take the place of sight. The radar's RF pulses cut through most atmospheric obstructions and darkness.
And he goes on to write that there's been other joint workshops since that time, and the Soviets have continued to send people who publicly acknowledge the risks of EMF.
The antenna is pointed exactly at the target. The operator
and
declutches
the Americans have continued to downplay it and be no effect men. If it's not hot enough to burn, if it doesn't have an ionizing radiation effect, then it basically doesn't exist to the American officials, and it hasn't for many decades, while the Soviets have repeatedly warned, and the American and the Western side, officially anyway, just pretended to be deaf and dumb about it. Robert O. Becker then goes on a couple pages later, picking up on 317, talking about invisible warfare. The Soviets have led the way in learning about the risks of electropollution, and as we've seen, they've apparently been the first to harness those dangers for malicious intent. So they've weaponized this knowledge about the biological effects of this non-ionizing radiation, and they were apparently the first to do so. However, the spectrum of potential weapons extends far beyond the limits of the Moscow signal, and Americans have been actively exploring some of them for many years. Yes, even during the years where they failed to warn the public about the potential risks and failed to do anything about the gross negligent liability of the health of the American population at large. Thanks. Americans have been actively exploring some of them for many years. Most or all of them following EMR effects can be scaled up or down for use against individuals or whole crowds or entire armies. The crudest of these would be a sort of electromagnetic flamethrower with a greater range than chemical types. Dogs were cooked to death in experiments conducted by the Naval Medical Research Institute as long ago as 1955. I feel bad for the dog, but what does that tell you about the larger picture? But again, that's pretty much the ionizing effects. They also found that high-power transmitters using short UHF wavelengths can severely burn exposed skin in mere seconds. They also studied the electromagnetic pulse, which could be set off by a nuclear bomb in the atmosphere, but also by other devices they've since unleashed. As you probably well know, this could shut down the communications, the power grids, everything for pretty much an entire continent, and it can happen in a split second. And they've at least been talking about ways to shield against that. The military has implemented and developed technology for that. He goes on to explain at some UHF power densities, there's an insidious moth-to-flame allurement, which would increase such a weapon's effectiveness. As discoverer Saul Michelson described it in 1958, each of the dogs used in his experiments, quote, began to struggle for release from the sling, showing considerable agitation and muscular activity. Yet, for some reason, the animal continues to face the horn that's blasting out the UHF signal. Perhaps as part of the same effect, UHF beams can also induce muscular weakness and lethargy. In Soviet experiments with rats in 1960, 5 minutes of exposure to 100,000 microwatts reduced swimming time and endurance tests from 60 minutes to just 6. Alan Frey's discovery that certain pulsed microwave beams increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier could be turned into a supplemental weapon to enhance the effects of drugs, bacteria, or poisons. So they found that using these signals opened up the blood-brain barrier and allowed things to go in there, chemicals and whatnot, poisons. Rossadae. The calcium outflow windows discovered by Rossadae could be used to interfere with the functioning of the entire brain. That's a powerful weapon. In the early 1960s, Frey found that when microwaves of 300 to 3,000 megahertz were pulsed at specific rates, humans, even deaf people, could, quote, hear them. The beam caused a booming, hissing, clicking, or buzzing, depending on the exact frequency and pulse rate. Again, they dial it in for the specific effect. And the sound seemed to come from just behind the head. So they've used that, at least experimentally, to torture people, to target someone, to make them feel crazy for hearing voices, that type of thing. That effect, the microwave hearing effect, has been written about, it's been proven, it's been experimented with, and what they're using it for, well, a lot of people speculate, a lot of people have anecdotal reports, but again, with all this liability, no one is likely to basically admit anything officially. But in the 1960s, Alan Frey also reported that he could speed up, slow down, or stop isolated frog hearts by synchronizing the pulse rate of a microwave beam with the beat of the heart itself. Similar results have been obtained using live frogs, indicating that it's technically feasible to produce heart attacks with a ray designed to penetrate the human chest. So yes, non-ionizing radiation from EMF can be used as a weapon. But just besides that, in the systems that are in place for communications and other electronic uses for transmitting stuff, for above board uses, there's still potential side effects that, because they haven't lowered the standards, they're not officially recognizing, and to the degree that it may be affecting the population in general, even if it's non-intended effects, well, they're not even being looked for. They're not acknowledged.
Blank said that even the increase in obesity, autism and stillbirths may be associated with electromagnetic radiation in the environment.
We are putting cellular antennas on residential buildings and on top of hospitals where people are trying to get well. Wireless utility meters and cell towers are blanketing our neighborhoods with radiation. It's particularly frightening that radiation from our telecommunication and power line technology is damaging the DNA in our cells. It is clear to many biologists that this can account for the rising cancer rates. And so today, scientists from around the world are submitting an appeal to the United Nations, its member states, and the World Health Organization.
Doctors are not looking to catch this. It's just taking whatever toll it may or may not take on the population. And again, this is pretty much how urban centers are set up across the country. If you live in a city or near a city, you're being affected. If you live out in the woods, deliberately in the middle of nowhere, I mean, at this point, I don't even know if you're not being affected there either. We live in a world where the grid is everywhere. These signals are all around the world at artificially high levels. We don't know what's happening.
Before Edison's light bulb, there was very little electromagnetic radiation in our environment. The levels today are very many times higher than natural background levels and are growing rapidly because of all the new devices that emit this radiation.
The frequency of the Earth is probably not surprisingly one that's very compatible with human and animal plant life. All right, so people respond very well with those signals, and artificial systems tend to hover around the 10 hertz or multiples of that rather than the Earth's natural signal. And it's interfering with our state of mind, our nervous system and biological functions are being tweaked just a little bit, interfered with just a bit off.
Scientists have discovered a human-made barrier around Earth, protecting against the natural particle radiation in space. They believe the bubble was formed by very low-frequency waves, or VLFs. VLFs have been found to interact with the particles in space, affecting how and where they move. VLFs are used for radio communications, including with submarines, because they can penetrate deep into the ocean. The waves can also travel far into the environment around Earth.
And I suspect this has wide-ranging effects, again, just through quality of sleep and the biological clock, the production of melatonin. It's changing the rest that people get. It's changing the ability of the body to repair and maintain things while the body's resting, because it's not resting properly. It's changing the consciousness, first of all, of people while they sleep, what they dream about, but also how they function in their waking life, interfering with cell reproduction, interfering with growth and development and maintenance, not good things. Interfering with people's nervous system, making them anxious, interfering with brain function. There's some very real detriment that could be caused by these signals. It's underappreciated, and it's just interesting that they did admit this back in the 70s. It has been in the paper, but officials even now, even before the 5G standards, act like they've never heard of this stuff. And that isn't credible. Government officials have done precious little, the bare minimum at best, to regulate and mitigate these dangers. And the people who warn about it and talk about it, they just get rolled up and thrown off into the crazy basket. Is it crazy? It's been studied scientifically. It's very clear that there are biological effects. It's just no one can really agree or admit to how low that threshold is. There are solutions and ways you can mitigate that. It's not just all buying things. I'm not going to get into that in this video, but there are ways to protect yourself, or at least to reduce the danger. But you have to be proactive about that. We have other videos about taking off our smart meter, getting that removed through the system. There's other information you could find about shielding. They make an electromagnetic shielding paint, and it's pretty expensive as far as paint goes, but it is available on the market. You can create shielded rooms. Your whole house could be shielded, that sort of thing. And there's other ways to do it also. And that can give you at least some sanctuary. But assuming you operate in the world, live in or near cities, commute to work in office buildings, interact in downtown areas, watch television, use cell phones, there's really a lot of exposure in your life. So, of course, obviously, you want to do what you can to mitigate that, stay healthy, and eat right, get the right kind of exercise to at least prevent problem areas from exacerbating, But I don't know. It's not encouraging. Really, this book and other books that this guy has written, really all the works that we've looked at by Robert O. Becker, it makes a pretty compelling case that the officialdom has been really eerily unconcerned about our general health. And I think people pick up on the vibe of that. It's not encouraging, but it is reason to be proactive, to do your own research, and to do what you can. With that said, humans are resilient. We do adapt. We can overcome certain effects, and we can adapt even to mutations. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that this is likely to have an effect species-wide. It may be subtly and gradually changing who we are, and it may be shortening the lives of people in that process. More studies need to be done, but we need an environment where they're not afraid of regulating this stuff and giving an honest analysis of the effects. Because for whatever reason, the Soviets were much more forthcoming in the Cold War era about this, and the West, and especially the United States, was not. For whatever reason, they were not forthcoming, and it's added to all of our risk and exposure levels. Those are just the facts. Anyway, there's more information in the Minds of Men documentary. It kind of explains some of the foundations leading up to this period, and kind of co-mingling with it through the MKUltra experiments and the rest of it. Also, the video that Melissa did on the Eugene, Oregon signal. I was there with her exploring Eugene, Oregon, and filming a lot of the stuff. That's a very good documentary that explores a lot of these aspects. And basically anything you could find about Ross Day and Alan Frey. Those are the two key researchers on the U.S. American Western side who really delved into this in detail. And these officials had a relationship with the CIA. They disclosed things to them, and the things they disclosed may well have been weaponized in the intervening period.
The master control for the whole body resides in the brain.
The patients were definitely
And
changed.
so I'm trying to get better about making more videos more quickly and doing sort of one-off things rather than researching for weeks and months at a time. We've been continually researching this topic the whole time that Melissa and I have known each other for years now. And we're going to do more research on this in the future. But for this video, for right now, I'm going to leave it here with the stuff I quoted from Robert O. Becker's The Body Electric. It's definitely a recommended book. And from the article that one of our great listeners sent in, thanks for doing that. All right, thanks for watching.